It is the middle of summer, and half of a peninsula that is supposed to be one of the most fortified places on Earth is sitting in the dark. 2.5 million people, beaches that should be packed, hotels that should be full, and instead, block after block of Sevastopol and Simferopol and Kerch goes black at night. The streetlights dead, the elevators frozen, the water pumps silent because the water pumps run on the electricity that is no longer there. On the maps the American satellites keep, you can watch the fires bloom one by one across the coastline, a thermal power plant burning with a column of smoke that reporters on the ground say climbs almost 30 miles into the sky. At the gas stations that are still open, the lines stretch for a kilometer, and the pumps are rationed to 20 liters a week per civilian car, because whatever fuel is left has been quietly reserved for the army. And at the foot of the Great Bridge, the one Vladimir Putin built and personally drove a truck across to celebrate, the traffic runs in only one direction now, out, toward Russia. Bumper to bumper, 5 hours to cross, people leaving a place they were promised was paradise. Here is the strange part. Nobody invaded to do this. No army came ashore. No tanks rolled through the isthmus. The peninsula that Russia turned into the most militarized patch of land on the Black Sea, the crown jewel, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, was brought to its knees in a single week without a single Russian soldier being pushed off it. So how does that happen? How does a fortress that the Kremlin spent something on the order of $60 billion making self-sufficient and untouchable simply switch off? And why did it collapse at the exact moment that, on paper, it was finally supposed to be free of everyone? This is the story of the $60 billion secret behind Crimea's collapse. The secret is not that Russia spent too little to defend it. The secret is what all that money was actually buying. And to understand it, we have to go back. Back to a spring day in 2014, when Russia won Crimea and inherited a problem it has never solved. It is March of 2014. The little green men have appeared at the checkpoints. The referendum nobody outside Russia recognizes has been held, and Vladimir Putin stands before parliament to announce that Crimea is coming home. Inside Russia, the euphoria is total. Approval ratings jump to numbers Western leaders can only dream about. For a moment it looks like the cleanest land grab in modern European history, a whole peninsula taken with barely a shot fired. But here is what the celebrations did not mention. The thing Russia had just annexed was not a self-contained kingdom. It was the far end of an extension cord, and the wall socket was in Ukraine. Think about how Crimea actually worked in early 2014. It had almost no water of its own. Around 85% of the fresh water on the peninsula flowed in from mainland Ukraine, down a Soviet-era channel called the North Crimean Canal, a 400-kilometer artificial river that pulled water from the Dnieper and carried it across the dry isthmus to irrigate the farms and fill the taps. It had almost no electricity of its own either. More than 80% of Crimea's power came across transmission lines from the Ukrainian grid. It had no land connection to Russia at all. Every truck, every train, every crate of food had to come by ferry or by air. Even the mobile phone networks depended on the mainland. Russia had captured the peninsula. What it had not captured was any of the things that kept the peninsula alive, and Ukraine knew exactly where those things were. So the punishment came methodically, one artery at a time, and watching Moscow try to replace each of those arteries at staggering cost is the whole story. Let me walk you through it, because each fix Russia built to escape its dependence turned out to be a brand new way to be dependent. Start with the water. In the spring of 2014, just weeks after the annexation, Ukraine walks up to the North Crimean Canal near the border and builds a dam across it, first an earthen berm, later reinforced with concrete. And just like that, the artificial river that fed the peninsula for half a century runs dry. Within a season, the canal is a brown scar of mud and weeds. The effect on Crimean agriculture is not gradual, it is a collapse. The cultivated farmland on the peninsula falls from around 140,000 hectares in 2013 to roughly 10,000 hectares by 2015. Rice paddies are simply abandoned. Cities begin rationing water. Trucks haul in bottled water. Moscow pours rubles into every scheme its engineers can dream up, drilling new wells until the groundwater turns brackish, damming local rivers, a plan to tap freshwater reservoirs under the Sea of Azov that never works, desalination plants that never get built at scale. Nothing replaces the Dnieper. You cannot conjure a river. And this is where the water story stops being about plumbing and starts being about something much darker. Because by 2021, after a brutal drought, Crimea's water crisis is genuinely desperate, and Russian generals and officials are openly describing the canal as a strategic objective. When the full-scale invasion comes on the 24th of February 2022, one of the very first things Russian forces do, on day one driving north out of Crimea, is seize the North Crimean Canal and the reservoir that feeds it. 2 days later, they blow up Ukraine's dam with explosives, and the water rushes back toward Crimea for the first time in 8 years. A historian who studies the region put it plainly: restoring the water to Crimea was not a side effect of the invasion. It was one of the reasons for it. Russia had discovered it could not engineer its way out of the dependency, so it decided to conquer its way out instead. And then, in a twist so bitter it almost writes itself, Russia loses even that. In June of 2023, the Novokakhovka Dam, the dam holding back the reservoir that fills the canal, is destroyed. Kyiv says Russia blew it. Moscow denies it. But whoever pushed the button, the engineering result is not in dispute. The reservoir that was the source of the water drains away, and the canal that Russia invaded a country to reopen loses its supply all over again. Russia had spent lives and years to turn the tap back on, and then watch the tank behind the tap empty out. That is the water, now the electricity, which is the heart of what is happening this summer. Rewind to November of 2015. Ukraine has not yet cut the power officially, but activists and saboteurs in Kherson do it for them. In the dark, someone brings down the transmission pylons at Chaplinka that carry electricity into Crimea. The lines go dead, and the peninsula discovers, in the cold, exactly how naked it is. Crimea can generate only about a third of the electricity it needs on its own. Its capital goes black. Simferopol reports central districts without power for more than 30 hours at a stretch. Hospitals run on generators. The occupation authorities declare a state of emergency and a public holiday because there is nothing else to do. 2 million people freezing in the dark because a handful of pylons on the mainland fell over. This is the humiliation that shaped everything Russia built next. Putin goes on television and promises an energy bridge, and Russia lays undersea cables across the Kerch Strait from the Russian mainland to feed Crimea power. That is the first patch. But the grand solution, the one meant to make Crimea truly independent, comes in 2019, when Putin personally opens 2 brand new gas-fired power stations, one at Balaklava, near Sevastopol, one called Tavrida, near Simferopol. Together they are promised to cover around 90% of the peninsula's electricity. The message is triumphant. Never again will Crimea be held hostage by a few power lines. Crimea is free, except it is not. And the reason is the secret at the center of this whole story. Look closely at those 2 power plants, and you find 2 dependencies quietly baked into the concrete. The first dependency is the turbines. Those plants were built around gas turbines made by the German company Siemens, transferred to Crimea in what the European Union said was a direct breach of its sanctions. Western technology, installed in a peninsula the West refused to recognize. And here is the trap. Because of those same sanctions, Russia cannot properly service or repair those turbines. The company that made them cannot legally send parts or engineers. So every one of these machines is, in a sense, unrepairable. Every hit it takes is permanent. Russia built the beating heart of Crimea's power grid out of a machine it is not allowed to fix. The second dependency is the fuel. Both of those plants run exclusively on gas. And that gas does not come from Crimea, because Crimea does not have it. It is piped in from the Russian mainland, which means the peninsula's electricity does not actually depend on the power plants at all. It depends on the pipeline feeding them, and on a handful of gas distribution and compressor stations that turn that gas into electricity. As a Crimean Tatar analyst told Ukrainian media this summer, the main plants run only on gas, so if you strike the gas infrastructure, you do not just dim the lights, you paralyze the generation itself. Do you see what Russia actually did? It spent a fortune to move Crimea's off switch. In 2014, the off switch was in Ukraine, on the power lines and the water canal. Russia found that intolerable, so it spent the next decade and tens of billions of dollars building an energy bridge, 2 power plants, and a road and rail bridge to move that off switch onto Russian soil. But it never eliminated the off switch, it just relocated it. and made the whole system depend on a smaller and smaller number of targets. One pipeline, a few substations, a handful of gas stations, turbines that can never be repaired. An energy analyst described occupied Crimea perfectly this summer. It is, he said, an energy dead end, no grid ring of its own, dependent on a single artery from Russia. And that brings us to the third and most famous artery, the one you have all seen, the Crimean Bridge across the Kerch Strait. 19 kilometers of road and rail, the longest bridge in Europe, built at a cost of around $3.7 billion and opened by Putin himself in 2018 and 2019. It is a genuine engineering achievement. It is also, in the language of this story, an umbilical cord. It is the single physical link that carries the food, the fuel, the troops, and the tourists between Russia and its prize. Cut it, and the peninsula is an island again. So step back and add it all up. By the best available estimates, Russia has poured somewhere in the tens of billions of dollars into Crimea since 2014. And by the time you count the subsidies year after year, the bridge, the highway, the airport, the energy bridge, the power plants, the water schemes, and the vast military buildup, that figure climbs towards $60 billion. One economist, tallying just the first years, put the cost at more than $20 billion, roughly 2 years of Russia's entire education budget. The Kremlin was still covering around 70% of Crimea's local budget out of Moscow's pocket. This was never a colony that paid for itself. It was a trophy kept on life support. And here is the $60 billion secret, stated plainly. All that money did not buy Crimea independence. It bought the appearance of independence, wrapped around a deeper and more fragile dependence than the one Russia started with. Every marquee project, the canal seizure, the power plants, the bridge, solved a headline while quietly creating a single point of failure. Russia advertised a fortress. What it actually built was a very expensive house of cards, held up by one pipeline, a few substations, an unrepairable set of turbines, and one bridge. For years, none of that mattered, because Ukraine could not reach any of it. And then Ukraine learned to fly. Now the history catches up to the darkness we started in. For most of this war, Crimea felt safe to Moscow, a rear base far behind the lines. That illusion dies piece by piece. The Kerch Bridge, the untouchable symbol, is struck and damaged more than once. The pride of the Russian Navy, the Black Sea Fleet, is hit so repeatedly in its home port of Sevastopol that Russia is eventually forced to pull much of it further east, out of range. The safe rear is no longer safe, and Ukraine draws the obvious conclusion. You do not need to storm the beaches of a fortress if you can reach inside it and pull out its wiring. By the summer of 2026, that strategy has a name and a commander. The man running Ukraine's drone campaign, the head of what Kyiv calls its unmanned systems forces, is an officer who goes by the call sign Medyar, Robert Brovdy, and his goal, which he has stated openly to the international press, is not to occupy Crimea, it is to isolate it. To sever every artery, one after another, until living and fighting on the peninsula becomes impossible. Watch how precisely it maps onto everything Russia built. On the 24th of June, a Ukrainian drone strike knocks out the electricity across all of Sevastopol, the home of the fleet. Not by bombing the power plant, but by hitting the dependency Russia engineered in, the gas that feeds it. Through late June and into July, the strikes come almost daily. Ukraine reports hitting the Simferopol gas distribution station, a major high-voltage substation in western Crimea, and on the 5th of July, a wave of strikes on substations plunges town after town into darkness. Yevatoria, Seki, Jomkoy, Krasnoparakopsk, while the Kerch thermal power plant burns, that 30-mile plume of smoke hanging over the strait. A Russian-installed official concedes, on Crimean state media, that around half of the peninsula is without power, and that rolling blackouts are now the way of life. He blames some of it, wonderfully, on technical faults, and at the same time, the fuel artery is cut too. From the 21st of June, a directive halts civilian fuel sales, and in Sevastopol drivers are rationed to that 20 liters a week while the reserves go to the army. Ukraine says it has hit the oil terminals in Kerch and the port facilities across the strait that feed them. There are reports, harder to confirm independently, of strikes on a shipyard in Kerch damaging vessels Russia was counting on for logistics, and of long columns of civilians and even soldiers' families joining the exodus back across the bridge. Treat the exact figures with caution. because both sides in this war have every reason to shape them. But the shape of it is not in dispute, and Russia's own proxies are the ones confirming the darkness. So what does Moscow do about it? For now, remarkably little, because there is little it can do quickly. Putin's suggested answer, according to the framing coming out of the Kremlin, amounts to patience. Simply wait it out. Russia says it is planning new generators to cover the growing shortfall, turning to Russian and Iranian turbines now that Western parts are permanently out of reach. But that is a plan measured in years, and the blackouts are measured in hours. You cannot pipe patience into a dead substation, and every month the pattern holds, the thing Russia spent $60 billion to prevent, a Crimea that cannot keep its own lights on, becomes the everyday reality anyway. The off-switch Russia worked so hard to move onto its own soil turned out to be exactly as reachable as the old one. It just costs $60 billion to relocate. Now, I want to be fair here, because this is not a video game, and these are not just receipts on a Kremlin balance sheet. The 2.5 million people in the dark on that peninsula did not choose the strategy playing out over their heads. Some of them cheered the annexation, and some of them never wanted it. And right now, in the heat of summer, they are the ones sitting without power, without running water from the pumps that need it, waiting in fuel lines, deciding whether to load the car and join the queue for the bridge. Whatever you believe about who Crimea belongs to, and people watching this will not all agree, and that is okay. The human cost of a peninsula being deliberately starved of electricity and water is real, and it lands on civilians first. But the strategic verdict is hard to argue with. For over a decade, Russia treated Crimea's dependence on the outside world as a problem it could buy its way out of. It built bridges and power plants and seized a canal and even invaded a country partly to turn a tap back on. And the deeper truth, the $60 billion secret, is that dependence was never something money could fix. It was the geography of the place. Crimea has almost no water of its own, and almost no fuel of its own, and no amount of concrete changes that. Russia did not make the peninsula independent. It just made itself the only supplier, and then strung that supply through a handful of targets a drone could reach. This story is not over. It is barely into its next chapter. The lights may come back on in Sevastopol tomorrow, and go out again next week. The bridge still stands, the fleet still floats somewhere further east, and Moscow still insists, as it always has, that Crimea is Russian and will stay that way no matter the cost. Maybe it will, but the myth that broke this summer, the myth of the self-sufficient fortress, is not coming back, because everyone can now see what was always true underneath it. Russia spent $60 billion to build a fortress. It forgot to check whether it could keep the lights on. And a peninsula that was sold to the world as unsinkable is, as its own officials keep admitting, sitting in the dark, in the middle of summer, waiting.